The Velthari Dominion had not known fear in 6,000 years. That was not arrogance. It was simply a fact, the kind of fact written in the wreckage of 400 civilizations that had made the mistake of standing in their way. The Dominion stretched across 4,000 star systems, governed by a high council of 11 beings who had lived long enough to watch suns dim. Their fleets had cracked moons. Their weapons had turned atmospheres into fire. Species that had taken millions of years to evolve looked upon the Velthari and did the only sensible thing. They bowed. So when the long-range probes flagged a new signal from the outer rim of the Orion Arm, a chattering, relentless broadcast of radio waves bleeding out of a small blue world around a mediocre yellow star, the High Council gave it exactly 4 minutes of attention. "Another emergence," said High Counselor Drevon, not looking up from his other work. "Send a herald, standard protocol." Standard protocol. That was what they called it. One Herald-class dreadnought, 6 kilometers of polished Velthari warship bristling with weapons capable of stripping a planet's crust, delivered to the threshold of the new species' home system. A single ultimatum broadcast in 700 languages. Then a deadline. Then, if necessary, and it was almost never necessary because most species took one look at the herald and began composing surrender speeches, a demonstration. A moon, usually, something visible from the surface, something that made the point. "We are the Dominion, you are new, bow or burn." Supreme Commander Veilthon had performed this ritual 19 times over his career. He was 63 years old by Dominion reckoning, a tall, gray-scaled being with 4 arms and the kind of quiet authority that came from having never lost. He stood on the bridge of the eternal verdict as it dropped out of faster-than-light travel at the edge of what the primitive species called the solar system, and he looked at the star ahead with professional indifference. The planet was the third from the sun, blue mostly, a thin veil of cloud. It was, he had to admit, a beautiful world. Most of them were before the demonstration. "Broadcast the ultimatum," he said. His communications officer sent it. 700 languages, 700 translations of the same fundamental message. "You have been found. You are small. Surrender your world to the Dominion's authority, submit to governance, and your people will be permitted to live as a client species under our protection. Refuse and your world burns. You have 48 hours. Veilthon settled into his command chair and waited. Usually there was silence first, the silence of a civilization absorbing the fact that they were not alone, and simultaneously the fact that they had already lost. Then came the transmissions, pleading sometimes, formal and trembling other times. Once memorably, a species had sent music, something mournful and achingly beautiful that Veilthon still thought about on quiet nights, even as he'd given the order to proceed with the demonstration. The humans took 11 minutes to respond. Veilthon checked the time twice. 11 minutes was fast. Most species needed hours to organize a response at all, scrambling their governments, convening emergency sessions, dissolving into internal panic. 11 minutes suggested either extreme efficiency or... The transmission came through. His communications officer's crest feathers flattened, an involuntary reaction, the Velthari equivalent of raising an eyebrow. "Commander, it appears they've sent audio only." "Play it." What came through the bridge speakers was laughter. Not the polite, diplomatic kind, not nervous laughter. Deep, genuine, sustained laughter, multiple voices. It sounded like, in what must have been some kind of command center, laughing the way beings laugh when someone has said something genuinely, absurdly funny. It lasted 14 seconds. Then a single human voice, male, unhurried, almost warm. "Give us a moment, we're finishing breakfast." Then the transmission ended. Veilthon stared at his communications panel for a long moment. Behind him, he heard the sound of his bridge crew trying to process what had just happened. His tactical officer cleared her throat softly. His xenolinguist pulled up the translation twice, as if reading it again might change it. "Is it possible the translation is incorrect?" Veilthon asked. "No, Commander, the translation is accurate." The xenolinguist hesitated. "They said breakfast." Veilthon stood up from his command chair and walked slowly to the viewport. Outside, the solar system floated in its ancient indifference, gas giants, a scattered belt of rock and ice, and that small blue planet that had just told the most powerful military force in the known galaxy to wait, because they were eating. He had delivered 19 ultimatums. He had been begged, wept at, bargained with, and once attacked by a species so terrified they launched every weapon they had simultaneously in a suicidal volley that had dented exactly 2 panels on his hull. He had never, not once, been asked to hold on. Something stirred in Veilthon's chest. Not quite fear. He was too experienced for fear, but something adjacent to it. Something that felt like the first cold drop of rain before a storm you didn't see coming. He turned back to his crew. "Begin full sensor sweep of the planet and surrounding space. I want to know everything: military installations, fleet strength, weapons signatures, power readings. Everything." "Yes, Commander." "And someone find out what breakfast is." The sensor sweeps came back within the hour, and Veilthon studied them with the focused attention of a commander who had learned never to be surprised twice. The humans had military infrastructure, he could see that. Space stations, yes. Vessels, certainly, though small by any meaningful standard. Weapons signatures consistent with a species perhaps 2 centuries into spacefaring capability. Nothing that should have worried him. What caught his attention was the volume of it all. Humans had a lot of ships. Not big ships, not sophisticated ships, but an extraordinary, almost irrational number of ships, and they were already moving. Not retreating, not scrambling in panic. Moving with purpose, sliding out of orbital stations and moonside hangars in organized streams, taking up positions that his tactical AI spent several minutes trying to classify before returning an answer that made him blink. Classification: unknown, possibly ceremonial formation, possibly malfunction in tactical assessment algorithm. No known species arranges a defensive formation in this pattern. Veilthon pulled up the formation visually. The human ships were spreading around his herald in a loose, almost casual envelopment, not threatening, not retreating, just surrounding him, like they were curious, like they were watching him the way one might watch an interesting stranger who had walked into a room uninvited. A second transmission came in. Different human voice this time, female, calm. "This is Admiral Yara Ose of the United Earth Defense Command. We've reviewed your message. We have some thoughts. When you're ready, we'd like to talk." Veilthon listened to it 3 times. Then he went to his quarters, poured himself a drink, and sat in the dark for a while. In 50 years of service to the Dominion, no species had ever made him feel like he was the one being assessed. He did not like the feeling. He liked even less that he could not explain it away, could not file it under arrogance or ignorance or suicidal defiance. The humans sounded, he realized, like they had done this before. Not this specifically, not an alien dreadnought at their doorstep, but this moment of something enormous and dangerous demanding their surrender. They sounded like beings who had stood in exactly this kind of moment many times and were still here to remember it. He set down his drink and pulled up the preliminary cultural database his probe had assembled over the past weeks. He needed to understand these creatures. He needed to understand why, when the most powerful empire in the galaxy had just told them to kneel. They had laughed. The Velthari had a saying, "Know the river before you cross it." It was wisdom born from 6,000 years of conquest. The empires that fell were always the ones that underestimated the current. Veilthon had built his entire career on this principle. Before every engagement, before every ultimatum, he studied. He learned. He understood his enemy so completely that by the time conflict came, it was not really conflict anymore. It was just the final page of a story he had already finished reading. He spent the next 36 hours reading humanity. His probe had been gathering data passively for weeks before his arrival, intercepting broadcasts, cataloging transmissions, assembling the raw, unfiltered noise of a species talking to itself. There were so many signals that his intelligence team had to write new sorting algorithms just to manage the volume. Humans, it turned out, communicated constantly. With each other, with machines, with the open air apparently, in dozens of languages, across thousands of cultural dialects, all simultaneously, all the time. The content of those communications was what kept his analysts awake. Visual broadcasts first. His team had pulled thousands of them, and within the first hour of analysis, a pattern emerged that no one was quite sure how to report. Humans, it appeared, enjoyed watching war. Not records of war, though there were those too, vast historical archives that his historians were still working through, but fictional war. Constructed, elaborated, artistically produced depictions of combat, death, strategy, and violence made purely for entertainment. His xenopsychology officer, a careful and methodical being named Thesson, watched 300 of these productions in a single sitting, and then submitted a report that was 17 pages long and ended with a single sentence that Veil-Thon read 4 times. "I am not certain this species experiences fear the way other species do." There were also the military parades. Humans paraded their weapons through their city streets while crowds watched and cheered. Not after victories, just periodically, apparently for morale, for pride. They put their tanks and missiles and aircraft on public display the way other species might display art or agricultural abundance or the symbols of their gods. The weapons were the symbols. Then there was the footage his team had flagged as a priority cultural document, recordings of something called a nuclear test, a weapon, thermonuclear in nature, detonated in open desert. The fireball rose above the earth in a perfect, terrible column. The shockwave rippled outward across the sand, and Veil-Thon watched the humans standing near the observation posts, watched them through the cameras they had pointed at themselves while pointing other cameras at the bomb, and the humans were smiling. Some of them were clapping. They had invented a weapon that could end cities, driven out into the desert, and applauded it. "How many of these weapons do they have?" he asked. His tactical officer checked the database. She hesitated before answering. "Our best estimate based on energy signatures and silo detections, approximately 12,000 active warheads, thermonuclear class." "And they haven't used them?" "Not since 2 were deployed approximately 78 years ago in an internal conflict. Since then, no. They built more but never used them." Veil-Thon leaned back. 12,000 weapons capable of turning cities to ash, sitting dormant in mountains and submarines and aircraft, just waiting. Not because the humans had run out of wars. The historical record showed constant conflict across that same period. They had fought dozens of wars without using the weapons they had. "Why?" he asked, mostly to himself. Thesson's voice came from the doorway. The xenopsychologist had taken to spending time on the command deck. "Because," he said quietly, "they were afraid of what would happen if they started, so they kept them as threats, each side threatening the other, a balance of potential destruction so catastrophic that everyone agreed not to move." He paused. "They call it deterrence." Veil-Thon absorbed this, so they built weapons they could not use. Weapons they chose not to use. There's a distinction, Commander. They could have used them, they didn't. Thesson moved to stand beside him. "That restraint, I've been trying to understand it, because it's not weakness. The same species that restrained themselves from thermonuclear exchange also sent ships out to meet ours. Our ships, Commander. A 6-kilometer Herald-class dreadnought, and they came out to meet it." Outside the viewport, Veil-Thon could see the human vessels. They were still there, that loose, uncategorizable formation that his tactical AI kept trying and failing to classify. They had not advanced. They had not retreated. They were simply present, holding position, patient as stone. And then his communications officer interrupted with something strange. "Commander, I've been monitoring communications between the human vessels. What are they saying? She looked almost embarrassed to report it. One of the pilots just transmitted a recipe to another pilot, a food preparation recipe for something called, she checked her notes, chili. The bridge was silent. Veilthon turned slowly to face her. They are exchanging recipes. Yes, Commander. The recipient replied to say that they preferred a different spice quantity, and they've been discussing it for approximately 12 minutes. Veilthon walked back to the viewport and looked at the human ships floating in the dark, their crews apparently engaged in culinary debate while a Velthari herald sat among them. He had a sudden, disorienting sensation, the feeling a seasoned hunter gets when the animal they've cornered turns around and sits down to groom itself. They weren't performing calm. That was the thing. He had seen species perform calm before. It always had a tightness to it, a brittleness around the edges. This was different. The humans were actually calm, or at minimum calm enough to argue about spices. That night he spoke privately with Thesson. They sat across from each other in his quarters with the planet visible through the small round viewport, and Veilthon said what he had been working up to all day. Is it possible that they simply don't understand how outmatched they are? Thesson considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. He had been a xenopsychologist for 40 years. He had profiled 36 species. He took a long, careful breath before answering. It's possible, he said. That's the charitable interpretation. He folded his hands. The other interpretation is that they understand exactly how outmatched they are. They've looked at the numbers, run the simulations, calculated the odds, and they simply don't care, because caring would not change what they're going to do anyway. Veilthon stared at him. That's not a military psychology, that's a pathology. Or, Thesson said softly, it's what you look like from the outside when you've been afraid for so long that you've metabolized it. When fear has become so woven into what you are that it no longer slows you down. He looked at the planet. Commander, these creatures evolved on a world where everything was trying to eat them. Then they started eating each other for hundreds of thousands of years. They've been in a state of existential threat since before they discovered fire. He paused. We showed up with a big ship. From their historical perspective, that's a Tuesday. Veilthon said nothing for a long time. Then he went to his desk and composed a message to the High Council. He chose his words very carefully. He did not say he was worried. Velthari commanders did not say they were worried. He said that he was proceeding with additional observation before delivering the final ultimatum. He knew, even as he sent it, that the High Council would not understand why. He was not sure he understood it himself. He only knew that something in the data, something in the laughter, something in the casual recipe exchange while his dreadnought sat in the dark among their tiny, battered ships, something told him that he was not reading this river right, that the current was different from anything he had ever crossed, that if he was not careful, he might be the one who drowned. Intelligence officer Siraven had broken into systems that most beings in the galaxy didn't even know existed. She had cracked the encrypted archives of the Mhethori Collective, a species so paranoid they stored data in quantum-locked crystals buried in the cores of dead stars. She had pulled the personal correspondence of 3 heads of state without any of them ever knowing. She had once extracted a complete military blueprint from a civilization's central archive, while their security systems were actively hunting her, finishing the job and leaving a false trail, all in under 4 minutes. She was, without question, the finest intelligence operative the Velthari Dominion had ever produced. So when Veilthon told her to break into the human military archives, she expected to be done by morning. She was not done by morning. The problem was not the human security. Their encryption was, by Velthari standards, embarrassingly primitive. She was through it in 20 minutes. The problem was what she found on the other side. The human military archive was not a single facility or a single database. It was an almost incomprehensibly vast, interconnected, cross-referenced accumulation of records spanning thousands of years, backed up across dozens of servers on 2 different continents, tied to historical databases, university archives, government records, personal memoirs, declassified documents, and something called the Internet, which appeared to be the sum total of human knowledge organized in a way that HFY could only describe as organized chaos. Everything connected to everything else by invisible threads of reference and citation. A living, breathing map of a species' entire intellectual history. She had not expected to find history. She had expected to find weapons counts and fleet deployments and maybe some battle plans. She found those too, but you could not find them without also finding the why behind them, the centuries of context that had produced them, the endless, winding, blood-soaked road that had led humanity to this moment. She started reading. She started with what she thought would be a quick scan of their major conflicts, a century overview, to get a sense of scale. By the 3rd hour, she had abandoned the overview entirely and gone deep, pulled into the specifics the way you fall into deep water before you realize the floor isn't coming. The humans had been fighting continuously for so long that their entire cultural output was saturated with it. Their art, their music, their literature, their religion, their philosophy, everything carried the fingerprints of a species that had never, for any sustained period, put down its weapons. Not because they were mindless. That was the thing that kept stopping her, kept making her sit back and stare at the ceiling of her small intelligence bay. They were not mindless. They wrote brilliantly about the horror of war. They composed music that could make even a Velthari weep if it were translated correctly. They built monuments to their dead that were staggering in their grief and beauty. They knew what war cost. They understood it with a bone-deep, culturally encoded clarity that most species never achieved. And they kept fighting anyway. Because the alternative, surrender, submission, allowing something external to define the boundaries of their existence, was, apparently, worse than the cost. She found the section on the 20th century and spent 6 hours there. This was the period that cracked something inside her professional detachment. 2 events in particular. First, something called the Second World War, a conflict so vast, so total, so consuming of human energy and life that it had reshaped the entire planet in 6 years. Nearly 80 million dead. The humans had industrialized warfare to a degree that made Velthari military historians look pedestrian by comparison. They had invented new ways to die faster than they could count the bodies. And at the end of it, they had sat down and built institutions, the United Nations, a whole architecture of international law specifically designed to prevent it from happening again. They knew it might happen again. They built the safeguards anyway. Then the Cold War. HFY read about the Cold War the way you read something that makes your hands go cold. 2 human nations, the largest on the planet, each with enough thermonuclear weapons to end all life on Earth several times over, spending 45 years pointing those weapons at each other. Not firing, not blinking, just holding. An entire geopolitical era defined by 2 powers standing across from each other at the edge of a cliff, each holding a rope tied to the other, each knowing that if either fell, they both went over. That had been their normal for nearly half a century. And they had won, not by fighting, by outlasting, by having the specific brand of human stubbornness that was capable of sustaining tension for decades without snapping. She flagged everything and composed her report for Veilthon, but even as she was writing it, her hands weren't quite steady. Because the more she read, the more she understood something that the original probe data hadn't captured. The probe had seen the weapons. It had seen the fleet. It had seen the military infrastructure. It had not seen what was behind all of it, what gave all of it meaning. Humans did not fight because they were aggressive. Well, they were aggressive, certainly, but that wasn't the root. The root was something far more complicated and far more dangerous. Humans fought because they loved things, fiercely, irrationally, with a totality that made no evolutionary sense. They loved their families with a ferocity that made them capable of charging into fire. They loved their nations, their cultures, their patches of earth, their ideas. They loved their species in an abstract way, even while fighting each other. There was a thread of human solidarity that ran beneath even their worst conflicts, something that surfaced every time an outside threat appeared. The Cold War enemies had cooperated in space. In the middle of their 45-year standoff, they had shaken hands in orbit. She included that detail in her report, highlighted it in red, wrote beside it, "This is what we are dealing with. They will fight each other until the moment an external threat appears. Then they will remember what they are." Then she wrote the conclusion that she had been avoiding for hours, because writing it made it real. "Commander, I believe we have made an error. We assumed that our arrival would divide this species, that internal fractures would slow their response, that the scale of our power would create dissent and surrender within their own ranks. The opposite has occurred. We have given them something to agree on. In the 17 hours since our ultimatum was broadcast, human political conflicts numbering in the hundreds have paused. Their media, which was previously divided into hundreds of competing narratives, is broadcasting a single unified feed. Two human nations that have been in active border disputes for decades have jointly deployed warships to this location." She paused before the final line, then wrote it anyway. "We did not threaten a divided civilization. We united one." She sent the report and sat back in her chair, looking at the ceiling. Then, because she was thorough and because something in the archive had caught her eye on the way out, she went back in one more time. There was a category of human media she hadn't explored yet, something labeled motivational speeches. She pulled a sample, ran the translation, and listened. It was a human standing before a large crowd, voice rising, talking about standing against impossible odds, about being afraid and doing it anyway, about the fact that every generation of humans had faced something that seemed like the end, and every generation had looked it in the eye and said. She stopped the recording. She already understood. She went to find Vale Thon. When the Velthari finally agreed to direct talks, Vale Thon had expected a politician. He had dealt with politicians before, smooth beings who arrived in expensive ships, draped in the symbols of their authority, trailing assistants and negotiators and legal advisors. They spoke carefully, held their faces in diplomatic arrangements, and tried very hard to look like they were not afraid even when they clearly were. What humanity sent was Admiral Yara Osai. She arrived alone, or as close to alone as a flag officer could be, a small crew, a single aide, no negotiating team. Her ship was called the INS Defiant, which Vale Thon's translator rendered literally, and he'd had to ask Thesson whether the humans had actually named their ship an act of defiance or whether it was a translation error. Thesson confirmed it was intentional. The ship had been named that way before this crisis. It was just, apparently, a name they liked. The Defiant was not an impressive vessel by any external measure. It was mid-sized by human standards, which made it small by everyone else's, and it bore the cosmetic evidence of a long service life, hull plating that had been patched and repatched, a sensor array that had clearly been replaced at least twice with components that didn't quite match, a lateral thruster housing that someone had welded back together with what Vale Thon's engineers described as improvised materials and alarming confidence. It flew, though. It flew steadily, and it docked with the eternal verdict without a tremble. Admiral Osai was 67 years old. Vale Thon knew this from the intelligence file Siraven had assembled. It also told him that she had served in 3 different conflicts over her career, that she had been wounded twice, that she had lost her right eye to a directed energy weapon in a war fought when she was 34, and had it replaced with a cybernetic implant that still, 33 years later, carried a faint blue glow. She was gray-haired, dark-skinned, and moved with the unhurried economy of someone who had learned a long time ago not to waste energy on performance. She walked into the meeting room with her aide one step behind her and looked around the space, Veilthon had prepared it carefully, arranged to subtly communicate Veilthari dominance through scale and material, and she looked at it the way someone looks at a room they're going to have to clean. Briefly, practically, already thinking about what came next. She sat down. She placed 3 things on the table. First, a ceramic cup of coffee, still steaming. She had apparently brought it with her from the Defiant and carried it through the docking corridor. She set it down gently, like it mattered. Second, a photograph. Physical, printed on actual paper, showing Earth from orbit, the whole blue marble of it, clouds swirled across the oceans, the landmasses soft and brown and green. It was not placed as a negotiating prop. She set it down the way you set down a photograph of something you love, facing herself, not him. Third, a single piece of paper, folded once. She placed it in the center of the table between them. Veilthon looked at it. What is that? The terms of your withdrawal, she said. He stared at her. She had said it the way you say something that is simply true, not aggressively, not theatrically. The way you say the sun rises in the east or water runs downhill. A statement of something that was going to happen, the details of which she was being kind enough to share in advance. Veilthon had 4 arms and had learned over 63 years to keep all of them very still when he needed to project control. He kept them still now. You are aware, he said carefully, that you are aboard a Herald-class dreadnought, that my vessel alone carries enough firepower to reshape your planet's geography. Yes, she said. And your fleet, what there is of it, is outmatched by a factor of. I know the numbers, she said, and picked up her coffee. He watched her drink it. She took a slow sip, set it down, and looked at him with the direct, assessing gaze of someone who was measuring the distance between what he was saying and what he meant. You were expecting us to beg, she said. It was not a question. I was expecting you to negotiate from an accurate understanding of your position, he said. I am. She pulled the folded paper slightly closer to him. That's your withdrawal timeline, a 72-hour window for your fleet to exit the system without further incident, an open channel for follow-up diplomatic contact, and one condition. She paused. You don't come back without an invitation. The silence in the room was absolute. Veilthon looked at the paper. He looked at the woman who had put it there. He looked at the photograph of the blue world she had placed facing herself. He looked at the aide standing behind her, a younger human, male, who was doing an admirable job of looking calm and was only betrayed by the slight, rhythmic tension in the muscles of his jaw. Then Veilthon smiled. It was a thin smile, the kind that had preceded bad outcomes for a lot of people over the years. Refused, he said. Admiral Osai nodded. She looked almost satisfied, not happy, not relieved. Satisfied. The way someone looks when something they expected to happen has happened. She picked up her coffee, took another slow, deliberate sip, set it down. I was hoping you'd say that, she said. She reached out, picked up the folded paper and slid it into the pocket of her uniform jacket. She did not throw it away. She kept it, as if she expected to need it again later. She stood. Her aide stood with her. She picked up the photograph and held it for a moment, looking at it, really looking at it, the way you look at something that reminds you of everything that matters. And then she slid it into a different pocket, close to her chest. She looked at Veilthon one last time before turning to leave. You have our contact frequency, she said. When you're ready to talk seriously, we're here. A pause at the door. We're not going anywhere. She walked out. Veilthon sat alone in the meeting room for a long time after that, looking at the spot where the paper had been. The coffee cup's ceramic ring had left a faint impression on the table surface. He looked at that too. Then he called his tactical officer. Prepare the fleet, he said. All ships to combat readiness. I want firing solutions on the 12 nearest human vessels by the time I reach the bridge. Yes, Commander. He stood, straightened his uniform, and walked toward the bridge with the measured step of a commander who had never lost and did not intend to start. He told himself the strange, tight feeling in his chest was anticipation. The feeling a warrior gets before a battle that will prove, once and for all, what is stronger. He told himself that. He almost believed it. What bothered him, what he could not explain, could not file away, was a very small thing. A detail. The way she had kept the paper. Not thrown it away, kept it. As if the withdrawal timeline was still going to be needed. The battle should have lasted 11 minutes. Veilthon's tactical AI had run the projections 14 times with different variables, accounting for human ingenuity, accounting for possible unknown technologies, even inserting a chaos coefficient for unpredictable behavior, and the answer had come back consistent across all 14 runs. 90 Velthari ships against 12 human vessels. Engagement duration, 9 to 13 minutes. Outcome, total human fleet destruction. Estimated Velthari losses, negligible. 2 ships, possibly 3, if the humans fought with particular recklessness. At the 11-minute mark, Veilthon had lost 7 ships. He stood at the tactical display with his hands clasped behind his back and watched the numbers that were not supposed to be possible, and he felt something that he had not felt in 40 years of command. Not panic. He was too old and too trained for panic. But the structural equivalent of it, the sensation of a foundation shifting, of the ground you had always stood on revealing that it was not as solid as you believed. The humans did not fight like anything in the Velthari tactical database. They did not fight like anything in any tactical database, because no database had been built to account for what they were doing. They fought like beings who had decided, individually and collectively, that the rules of engagement were merely suggestions. The Velthari battle doctrine was sophisticated, centuries refined, optimized through thousands of engagements. It assumed opponents who reacted to damage predictably, ships that took hits withdrew, regrouped, covered their wounded vessels. Ships that lost shields fell back. Ships that lost engines became targets. Human ships took hits and pressed forward. Not because they hadn't noticed. The damage was real. Veilthon could see it on his sensors, could see hull breaches opening on the human vessels, could see power readings fluctuating wildly, could see ships that had no tactical business still being operational. They rerouted. They improvised. They did things with their own damage that his engineers watched with expressions that mixed professional horror and grudging admiration. One human frigate, its primary weapons array destroyed in the first exchange, had reconfigured its cargo transport beam into an energy disruptor in the middle of battle. It was not efficient. It was not elegant. It worked. The human formation, still officially unclassifiable by his tactical AI, turned out not to be a formation in the Velthari sense at all. It was something more organic. The human ships were in constant communication, adapting in real time, each vessel making independent decisions that nonetheless wove together into something that looked like chaos from outside, but functioned like a living organism. They covered each other without being ordered to. They took turns absorbing fire to protect ships that were better positioned to respond. They prioritized not as a computer calculates priority, but as people do, instinctively, reading the moment. At the 7-minute mark, one of his destroyers went dark. Then another. Then a Velthari cruiser, a proper cruiser, not a light vessel, something that had survived engagements with 3 other civilizations, took simultaneous fire from 4 human ships working in concert and lost its forward power coupling. It did not explode. It drifted, but it was out. At the 9-minute mark came the moment that Veilthon would remember for the rest of his life. A human frigate hull breached in 2 places, engines running at 11% of capacity, leaking coolant in a visible arc behind it like a wound, should have been dead. His tactical AI had marked it as a mission kill 6 minutes into the engagement, but it was still moving, still fighting, and now it was doing something that made no tactical sense. It was accelerating toward his command ship. Not toward any target of strategic value, toward the eternal verdict. His sensors showed him the interior of the frigate, emergency pressure doors closed, crew condensed into the forward sections, the rest of the ship sealed off. And then the frigate's crew did something extraordinary. They manually opened a ruptured plasma conduit, a conduit that had been blown out in the initial exchange and that, in any rational damage control scenario, should have been sealed and abandoned. They opened it on purpose, let it vent, directed the plasma outflow through the breach in the hull toward the eternal verdict sensor array with a precision that should not have been possible with a ship in that condition. It blew out his port sensor cluster. Not catastrophically. It would take hours to repair, but the eternal verdict was now blind on one side. Because one human crew in an 11% capacity ship with a dead engine and 2 hull breaches had decided that the best weapon available to them was their own damage. Vale Thon stood at his tactical display and stared at the readout. He did the math. He had 90 ships, 12 humans. He had lost 7 so far. The humans had lost 2. At this rate, with these exchange ratios, he would win, eventually. He had the numbers, the tonnage, the firepower, the fresh ships. He would grind through the human fleet the way a glacier grinds through rocks slowly, inevitably. He would win. But the human ships behind these 12 were already moving. He could see them on long-range sensors. Dozens, then hundreds, streaming out of orbital stations and lunar facilities and positions he hadn't even properly mapped yet, forming up in the distance with that same organic, unclassifiable fluidity. And behind those, "How many more are there?" he asked quietly. His sensor officer checked twice. "Best estimate, Commander, 900 additional vessels in the first wave, with indications of further mobilization." She paused. "It appears the entire planet is mobilizing." Vale Thon looked at the tactical display. His 7 lost ships, the human frigate, still somehow limping in an arc nearby, its crew presumably still alive in their sealed forward section. He looked at the human fleet massing in the distance. He made the calculation, the real calculation, not the one about who would win in isolation, but the one about what winning would cost. How many ships he would lose, how long this would take, how much of the Dominion's power would be left after grinding through a species that treated damage as a weapon and treated impossibility as a minor inconvenience. And humanity had a planet behind them. They had 12,000 nuclear weapons he'd never been able to confirm targeting solutions for. They had 900 ships already moving, and more being mobilized. And every one of them was crewed by beings who had, apparently, named their ships Defiant and carried photographs of home, and sent each other recipes between engagements. Vale Thon made a decision that no Velthari commander in 6,000 years of history had made. "All ships," he said, "withdraw to 2 light minutes, maintain position, do not fire unless fired upon." The bridge was completely silent. "Commander," his tactical officer began. "I said withdraw." He did not raise his voice. He didn't need to. The eternal verdict turned in the black and the Velthari fleet pulled back. On his sensors, the incoming human fleet slowed, held, waited. A transmission came from the INS Defiant. Admiral Osai's voice, calm, unhurried, the same as it had been in the meeting room. He could hear very faintly the sounds of her bridge behind her, consoles beeping, voices moving crisply through operational exchanges. Normal sounds, working sounds. "When you're ready to talk," she said, "we're here." Then, after a brief pause, "I'll make coffee." 2 days of silence. The Velthari fleet held at 2 light minutes and did nothing. The human fleet held between them and Earth and also did nothing. If you had looked at the solar system from a sufficient distance during those 48 hours, you would have seen 2 forces poised across from each other in the dark, and you might have thought, the moment before a storm, the held breath before an explosion. But inside the eternal verdict, Vale Thon was not preparing for a storm. He was thinking. This was unusual. He had always been a thinking commander. Strategy was nothing if not applied thought, but this was different. This was the kind of thinking that isn't really about tactics. The kind that happens in the part of the night when you can't sleep and the ship is quiet and the weight of something you can't quite name settles on you in the dark. He sat in his quarters with the lights low and the viewport showing nothing but stars, and he thought about human beings. He had asked for a full profile on Admiral Yara Osai specifically. Seer Evin had delivered it. He read it the way you read about someone who has impressed you against your will, looking for the thing that explains them. She had been born in a place called Lagos. She had studied applied physics before pivoting to military service at 22, following something the file called the North African Crisis, one of the many low-grade conflicts his analysts were still cataloging. She had risen through ranks that were not easy for someone of her demographic background in the era she came up in. There were records of the friction, documents she had written about institutional resistance that were careful and precise and completely without self-pity. She had commanded her first ship at 31, lost crew members in all 3 major conflicts she served in, received the highest human military honor twice, retired at 65, then come out of retirement 6 months ago when the Vilthari probes were detected. She had come out of retirement for this. He thought about that. A 67-year-old being, one eye replaced with a machine who could be spending whatever remained of her life in peace, who had earned peace, by any measure choosing instead to come out here, to sit across from him, to put a withdrawal timeline on the table with her coffee. He opened a private channel. He half expected her not to answer or to route it through an aide. She answered herself. "Commander." Her voice had that quality he was coming to recognize, alert, present, carrying no excess. "I have a question," he said. "All right." He had been formulating it for 2 days. He had tried to make it sound strategic, analytical, the question of a tactician trying to understand an opponent. But in the quiet of his quarters at this late hour, he said it the way he actually meant it. "Why do you fight this hard for a world so broken?" A pause, not discomfort. She didn't seem to experience the conversational discomforts most beings did. More like she was taking the question seriously. "What did you read?" she asked. "Everything," he said. "Your wars, your centuries of them, your weapons, your history." A pause. "Your pollution, your inequality, the political fractures, the resource disputes. By every external measure, Earth is a world that cannot agree on anything." "That's accurate," she said. "And yet," he gestured at nothing, at the stars outside his viewport. "Here you are." She was quiet for a moment. He could hear her breathing, steady, unhurried. He had the impression she was also sitting in the dark somewhere. "Let me ask you something," she said. "Do you have children, Commander?" The question surprised him. "A daughter. She is grown." "When she was small, did she ever fall, hurt herself, do something that worried you?" He considered this. "Yes." "Did you stop loving her because her knees were scraped, because she made mistakes, because she wasn't perfect?" He was quiet. "Earth is ours," Admiral Osai said. "It's broken in 100 ways. We know that better than you do. We live with every broken thing every day. We're in the middle of trying to fix it. We've been trying to fix it for a long time. We haven't finished." A pause. "But it's ours, and we fix our own problems. We don't surrender them to someone else. Even if that someone else is stronger." "Yes," she said simply. "Even then, because strength that we didn't earn isn't a solution, it's just a different problem." Something shifted slightly in her voice, not softer but more direct. "Commander, your species has been in the business of taking things from people who couldn't stop you. I understand that, I've read about it. But here's the thing, in our history, every time something that looked like you showed up and told us to hand over what was ours, we didn't. Not ultimately. Not permanently. We paid terrible costs sometimes, but we didn't. She seemed to search for the right word. "It's structural, it's in us." He looked at the stars. "Your world is broken," he said again, but it came out differently this time. Not as an argument, almost as a real question, the kind you ask not to challenge someone but to understand. Yes, she said, and we're working on it, have been for a while, we'll keep working on it. A quiet sound that might have been a small laugh. We're stubborn that way. He ended the call an hour later and sat in the dark, turning over what she had said. The scraping of a child's knees, the broken world they were working on, the structural refusal, not ultimately, not permanently. He thought about a passage in the historical archive that CI-FI had flagged. A speech, given by a human leader at the end of one of their larger wars. He had read it twice and been unable to fully explain why it had stayed with him. The leader had described the costs, extraordinary costs, generational costs, and then said that the species would not have survived to pay them if they had been willing, at any earlier point, to simply stop. It was not that humans didn't count the cost. They counted it. They knew exactly what it was. They paid it anyway. What do you do, Veilthon thought, with a species like that? What do you do when threatening them only makes them count the cost and decide it's worth paying? He had an answer somewhere in him, but it was an answer that sat badly with everything he was and everything he had built his career on. It felt like the kind of answer that, once acknowledged, could not be unacknowledged. He went to find Thesson. The xenopsychologist was awake. He had been awake most nights since their arrival, Veilthon had noticed. He sat with him, and for a long time they didn't speak. Then Veilthon said, "In your assessment, if we proceed, if we bring the full Dominion fleet to bear, every resource, a true campaign." "We could win," Thesson said. "Militarily, yes." "But—" Thesson looked at his hands. "Militarily we could win. Strategically," he shook his head slowly. "Winning against an enemy that doesn't stop means your victory is only the beginning. It means garrison, it means insurgency. It means fighting them on the ground, on their own world for decades, maybe longer, because, Commander," he looked up, "they will not stop, even after they lose. History is very clear about that. When humans lose, they find new ground and they start over. There is no such thing as a permanent defeat of a people that decided, culturally, genetically, historically, not to accept one." Veilthon stared at him. "What are you telling me?" "I'm telling you," Thesson said carefully, "that there is a kind of war you cannot win even when you win every battle." A long pause. "And I think you already know that. I think that's why you called the withdrawal." Veilthon said nothing. "The question," Thesson continued very quietly, "is what you do now that you know it." Report arrived from the High Council's Intelligence Bureau 3 days after the withdrawal, and it arrived with a classification stamp that Veilthon had seen only once before in his career, the deep red seal of omitted intelligence, reserved for information that had been gathered, assessed, and then deliberately not circulated. The seal meant, this was known. It was decided that you should not know it. Read carefully and understand why we are telling you now. He broke the seal and read. It took him 4 hours. He read some sections twice. He read one section 3 times, set down the datapad, stood at his viewport for 15 minutes, and then came back and read it again. The summary, reduced to its core. Humanity was not unknown to the wider galactic community. That was the thing the Dominion had never suspected, because the galactic community had never said a word about it. 17 species, 17 separate, independent civilizations with no particular reason to coordinate, had detected or made contact with Earth at various points over the past 100 years. Some had been subtle about it, passing through the system in stealth, observing from distance. A few had made limited direct contact. One had spent nearly a decade conducting careful, disguised interaction with a handful of humans before concluding their study. All 17 had reached the same conclusion. All 17 had then done the same thing, filed their reports, buried the findings in restricted archives, and said nothing to anyone else. The Velthari Intelligence Bureau had only found this because they'd gone looking specifically. And even then, the digging had taken months, because the silence had been so consistent, so universal, so carefully maintained. Veilthon read the cross-referenced consensus document. It had been compiled by his analysts, pulling the relevant findings from all 17 reports and assembling them into a single assessment. 17 different species, 17 different methodologies, 17 different frameworks for evaluating a civilization. The specific observations varied. The conclusion did not. He read the consensus finding. Read it once quickly, then read it slowly. Humanity is not an emerging threat. Humanity is a contained catastrophe, contained, critically, by their own choice, and by the deterrent of mutual assured destruction they have constructed among themselves. The potential represented by their psychological profile, their physical adaptability, their cultural capacity for collective endurance, and their demonstrated capability for industrialized warfare exceeds any projection that can be reasonably modeled. They are, by any objective assessment, the most dangerous species we have encountered, not because of their technology, which is unremarkable at this stage, but because of what they are. Do not mistake their internal conflicts for weakness. Do not mistake their divided politics for a vulnerability. Do not make them feel cornered. Do not make them feel that what they love is at risk. If you do, you will discover the difference between a species that fights and a species that does not stop. One of the individual reports, from a species called the Yanathi, a quiet, long-lived civilization with a gift for pattern recognition, had added a single-line annotation to their copy of the findings, a postscript that Veilthon's analyst had reproduced in full. We observed them for 9 years. We watched them come to the edge of extinction several times and pull back. We watched them love things and fight for those things past all reason. We are a species that has survived 4 billion years. We have never been afraid of anything in the way that we are, sitting here, quietly, profoundly afraid of what humanity will become. We are leaving this system. We are not telling anyone about it. We recommend you do the same. The Yanathi had left their report dated 62 years ago. 62 years. The information had been sitting there, accessible, theoretically retrievable for 62 years. And in all that time, in all the intelligence sweeps and galactic surveys and strategic assessments the Dominion had run, no one had thought to ask, what do other species know about this blue world that they haven't mentioned? No one had thought to ask, because no one had thought there was anything to mention. Veilthon called an emergency briefing of his command staff. They came in to find him standing at the tactical display with the lights fully up and the fleet readouts on all screens, and they took their places with the quiet precision of experienced officers who could read the room and knew this was not a routine briefing. He told them what the report said. He read them the consensus finding. He read them the Yanathi annotation. The room was very quiet when he finished. His tactical officer spoke first. How did 17 species all choose not to share this? Veilthon looked at her. How do you think? She was quiet for a moment, then she understood, because sharing it would mean someone would act on it. And acting on it, Veilthon said, meant the risk of exactly what we have done. He let that sit. 17 civilizations looked at this species, made their assessment, and independently decided that the safest outcome for everyone, including themselves, was to leave humanity alone and say nothing to anyone who might disagree. He closed the report. They were not protecting us from the information. They were protecting themselves from the consequences of us having it. His second officer, a veteran named Kersh who had served with him for 20 years, leaned forward slowly. So every species that found them just backed away quietly. Yes. And said nothing. Yes. And we were the first to actually. Yes, Veilthon said, we were. The silence that followed was the kind that happens when a room full of experienced, intelligent people all finish the same thought at the same time, and none of them particularly wants to be the one to say it out loud. Veilthon said it. We did not come here to threaten a primitive civilization, he said. We came here without knowing it to wake something up. He looked around the room, the faces of beings who had followed him through 19 operations without a single catastrophic failure. The question before us now is, what do we do about that? Nobody answered immediately. Then Sierra Ven, quiet in the back of the room where she had been standing since the briefing began, spoke for the first time. "There is one other thing," she said. "From the Yanathi report, a final observation made by their lead researcher in a personal addendum, not official, just a note." She looked at Veilthon. She wrote, "I asked one of them why they keep going. Why, given everything, the wars, the costs, the cycles of it all, they don't simply stop." He thought about it for a while. Then he said, "Because someone has to, and we're the ones who are here." The room was very still. Veilthon looked at his fleet readouts, at the sensor display showing the human ships holding their position between him and the blue planet, at the numbers he'd been running for the past 2 days, not the battle projections, but the other ones. The ones about what happened next, and after that, and after that. He made a decision. "Raise Admiral Osai," he said. "It's time to have an honest conversation." They met on neutral ground this time. A human space station, mid-sized, functional, bearing the same aesthetic of practical endurance that seemed to define everything humanity built, positioned at the L4 point between Earth and its moon. Veilthon arrived with Thesson and Sierra Ven. Admiral Os arrived with her aide, and a woman she introduced as Dr. Amara Diallo, described simply as someone who understands long-term things. Diallo was a historian and a diplomat, 72 years old, who had spent her career working on exactly the kind of conflicts that most species had given up as unsolvable. She had the calm of someone who had sat across from very difficult things for a very long time and had learned to wait. They met in a room that had a round table, a human design choice, Veilthon noted, that distributed equality spatially. No head of the table, everyone equidistant from the center. Someone had made coffee. The smell of it had filled the room by the time he arrived. A human crew member had also, inexplicably, put a small potted plant in the corner, something green and persistent looking. Veilthon found he kept noticing it. The negotiations took 3 days. This is not the place for every detail of those 3 days. The careful unpacking of the ultimatum, the Dominion's face-saving language for withdrawal, the long discussion about future contact protocols, the genuine back-and-forth about what a relationship between the Velthari Dominion and humanity might eventually look like, if both parties survived this initial collision with their dignity roughly intact. Those were 3 days of real work, of the slow, patient, unglamorous labor of building something out of what had nearly been a catastrophe. What mattered happened on the last evening. The formal sessions were done. Documents had been drafted, a non-aggression accord, a framework for future contact, a timeline for the Velthari fleet's withdrawal from the solar system. They would need to be ratified by the High Council, and that process would have its own difficulties, but the substance was settled. Everyone in the room knew it. The sense of conclusion was palpable, a kind of collective exhale that people allow themselves when the hard part is behind them. They stayed at the table. Someone brought more coffee. Veilthon accepted a cup. He had been drinking it for 3 days and had developed what he was not prepared to admit was a preference. The conversation became less formal, the way conversations do when the work is done, and what remains is simply being in a room with people you have just been through something with. Thesson was talking with Dr. Diallo about the history of first contact protocols. She seemed to know more about Velthari diplomatic history than he had expected, and he was asking her about her sources with visible professional delight. Sierra Ven and the human aide had discovered a shared interest in intelligence methodology, and were having what looked like an animated and extremely classified conversation in the corner. The potted plant sat in its corner, unremarkably alive. Veilthon sat across from Admiral Osai. Between them, 2 coffee cups and the comfortable weight of something that had been resolved. He had been carrying a question for weeks, not a tactical question, not a strategic question, A real one, the kind that doesn't resolve itself through briefings or intelligence reports or even 3 days of careful negotiation. He had been carrying it since the very first moments of this, since that 14-second transmission, the laughter, the warm and unhurried voice telling him to wait. "I have one more question," he said. She looked at him across the table, attentive as she always was. He had come to appreciate that about her. She was genuinely present in conversations, not performing presence, actually there. "The first transmission," he said. "When we delivered the ultimatum, your response was—" "Laughter," she said. "Yes," he looked at her. "I have been trying to understand it. 14 seconds of laughter. Then a man who said to wait. Everything I've learned in the months since, the history, the intelligence files, the 3 days here, I understand more about your species than I did. But I still don't fully understand that specific moment. Why did they laugh?" Admiral Osai was quiet for a moment. She looked down at her coffee cup, turned it slightly in her hands the way she did when she was thinking carefully. "You have to understand something about where we've been," she said finally. "Our history, you've read it, the wars, the threats, the things pointed at us across our own world by our own people." She looked up. "We've been under existential threat in one form or another for our entire existence as a species. Something was always trying to kill us, or we were trying to kill each other, for hundreds of thousands of years." She paused. "You get a specific kind of relationship with that over time. With threat, with the thing that shows up and says you're going to lose." "What kind of relationship?" "An honest one," she said. "When you've been threatened that many times by that many things and you're still here, you stop being surprised by the threat. You start being almost," she considered, "familiar with it, like an old pattern. You see the shape of it coming before it arrives and you think, yes, yes, here it comes again. The big thing, the overwhelming thing, the thing that says we can't win." A small pause. "And then you think, well, we're still here." Vale Thon was listening carefully. "The man who told you to wait," she said, "was Captain Ignacio Ferreira. He was on communications duty that morning. I know him. He's been in service for 22 years. He's fought in 2 conflicts. He's buried crew members." She picked up her coffee. "When he heard your ultimatum, he heard the shape of something he'd heard before in different forms. Something enormous telling him that it was over, that the numbers didn't add up, that there was no way out." She took a sip. "And he laughed. Because the something enormous has always been there, and humanity has always been here too." She set the cup down. "The laughter wasn't arrogance, it wasn't stupidity, it was recognition. We recognized the moment. We'd been in that moment collectively 10,000 times, and we'd always come out the other side." "So you knew you could win," Valthon said. "No," she said. "We didn't know that. We still don't know what would have happened if things had gone differently." She looked at him steadily. "But here's the thing you need to understand about humanity, Commander. We don't need to know we can win. We need to feel like we're going to try. Those are different things. Knowing you'll win means you've calculated the odds and they're in your favor. Deciding to try means the odds don't change what you're going to do." A long pause. "We decided to try before we had any idea what you were. That's not courage exactly. It's just what we are." Vale Thon sat with that for a while. The room around them had the soft sound of ongoing conversation, of 2 species who had nearly destroyed each other finding, tentatively, that they could also just talk. Through the station's small viewport, Earth was visible, the blue marble, the thin veil of cloud. The same photograph Admiral Osai had brought to the first meeting, except now he was looking at the real thing. "You said something else," he said. "When I came to the first meeting, you said you knew something I didn't, that we'd blink first." She smiled. It was the first time he had seen her smile, a real one, not the professional arrangements of expression that diplomacy required. It was warm and a little tired and completely genuine. "I didn't know that for certain," she said, "but I thought it was likely." "Why?" "Because you came here to make an example," she said, "and we didn't have anything to lose. That's always a terrible position to be in, fighting someone who has nothing to lose. They don't calculate the cost the same way. They fight until there's nothing left." She looked at him. And we had something to lose, but we'd already decided the cost of losing it was worth what we'd pay to keep it, which, from a tactical standpoint, is also a terrible thing to fight, he finished. Yes, she said. We were both terrible to fight, but you had something to protect, the Dominion, your reputation, your ships, your people who'd go home at the end of this. She was quiet for a moment. When you realized that winning would cost you more than it was worth, you had somewhere to go. You could step back. You could choose something different. She looked at her coffee. We didn't have that option, or we didn't see one, so we weren't going to stop. Vale Thon looked at the planet through the viewport for a long time. That photograph, he said, the one you brought to the first meeting, you kept it, even when you thought there might be a battle. Yes. Why? She glanced out at the planet and then back at him. The smile was still there, quieter now. Same reason you keep things that matter to you. When you're going into something you're not certain of, you keep the thing that reminds you what you're doing it for. A pause. It's not complicated, Commander. It just looks complicated from outside. She picked up her coffee for what would be the last time that evening. We're not mysterious. We're just stubborn about the things we love. They sat together for a little while longer, while the station hummed around them and the conversations continued in the corners, and the small green plant sat in its pot doing exactly what it was built to do. Then Admiral Os set down her empty cup, straightened in her chair, and looked at him with the direct, measuring gaze he had come to know. For what it's worth, she said, I'm glad it went this way, rather than the other way. As am I, Valethon said, and he meant it fully, without the diplomatic qualification his training would usually put around such a statement. He simply meant it. The Velthari fleet departed the solar system 22 hours later. Valethon stood at the viewport of the eternal verdict as they passed the outer edge of the heliosphere, Earth's sun shrinking behind them to a bright point among many. He stood there for a long time. His aide, tactful as always, said nothing. He thought about what he would tell the High Council. He was already composing the report in his mind, the careful language, the face-saving framing for the accord, the strategic rationale for the withdrawal. He was good at these things. He would find the right words. But underneath the words, underneath the report and the rationale and the careful framing, what he would carry from this, what he would carry for the rest of his life, was simpler, smaller, the kind of thing that doesn't go in official reports. A photograph kept in a breast pocket. A plant in the corner of a meeting room. The sound of laughter across 14 seconds of static. A species that had survived everything its own history had thrown at it, and had emerged from all of it not hardened into something cold and tactical, but somehow still capable of making coffee for the person they'd been ready to fight. Still capable of caring about a blue world with scraped knees and unfinished problems, and deciding that it was worth everything to protect it. He thought about the Yanathi researcher's note. Someone has to, and we're the ones who are here. The star fell behind them. Earth and all its people, drinking their coffee and arguing about spice quantities, and carrying photographs of home and building things with improvised materials and alarming confidence, fell behind them. Valethon looked at the dark ahead, and for the first time in 40 years of command, he found himself wondering, not with dread, but with something more complicated, what humanity would become. What they would build and who they would be when they finally came into the wider galaxy, not as the cornered thing defending its home, but as themselves. He suspected the galaxy was not ready. He suspected they would smile about that too. The end.